right, welcome to the second reading of OverSeaUnderStone by Susan Cooper. Um, and we left off last time with the Drew children finding that kind of trapdoor ladder up to some kind of hidden study in the Gray House. And so, let me start, however. We were thinking that we could kind of start doing a little bit of like an open mic, like 10 minutes at the beginning, where if somebody, mentions to me beforehand that they want to read something or that they want to play a song or something like that, I think that'd be cool, and for a lot of reasons. But on Thursday, Kevin read a poem before we started the book, but his audio was a little shaky, so he's trying it with the AirPods this time. And he's getting his pipes wet, ready with some water there. Oh yeah.
I'm actually gonna go old school and do the wired.
No, 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 no.
Na, 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 na.
Oh, taking it one note up. I don't even need to help you. Gosh, you're an expert. Okay, here we go.
I'm gonna go old school and do the wired earphones.
So what are we hearing today?
So today, this is a poem titled Wild Geese.
Oh, cool.
By Kristen O'Keefe Aptowicz.
Awesome. All right, here we go.
Yes.
Wild Geese.
Here we go. You don't have to be crushed under the spokes of your own desire to be proven worthy enough. The trophies of your hard work don't have to appear so freshly on your body. Your clothes need not be torn. Every night you worry a new bird's nest into your hair. Every night your dreams grind you under her boot heel. Under her boot heel. Your pendulum heart doesn't need to swing so hard in either direction. Nails don't have to be bitten to the nub. You have to believe that the ground will materialize under your feet the moment you step forward. No one can tell you if it will be rock, gravel, or slick with paint. No one can travel this road before you do. It is yours, and it is beautiful because of it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It made me think of the Camino de Santiago at the end there.
Oh, very nice.
Because sometimes people crawl on their knees or they're bleeding on the trail or things like that. And yeah, wow, that was a good one.
Right.
Thank
Cool.
you.
Thanks, and thanks again for allowing me to do this, Max. Appreciate that.
I'll allow it. So for you iPad folks, for the video, if you want to hear Kevin's poem better, go to the audio archive on the website. Okay, so here we go. We are at chapter 3, and thank you everybody for joining. It makes me happy to see all of you. All right, I'm on an exercise ball too, so if you see me bouncing, it's not an earthquake. All right, chapter 3. As Simon's head emerged through the hatch at the top, he caught his breath, just as Barney had. And sneezed enormously. Clouds of dust rose and the ladder shook. "Hey," said Barney protestingly from below, drawing his face back from his brother's twitching heels. Simon opened his watering eyes and blinked. Before him and all around was one vast attic, the length and breadth of the whole house, with 2 grubby windows in its sloping roof. It was piled higgledy-piggledy, ooh, that's a hard one, with the most fantastic collection of objects he had ever seen. Boxes, chests, and trunks lay everywhere, with mounds of dirty gray canvas and rough coiled ropes between them. Stacks of newspapers and magazines, yellow-brown with age. A brass bedstead, and a grandfather clock without a face. As he stared, he saw smaller things. A broken fishing rod, a straw hat perched on the corner of an oil painting, darkened by age into one great black blur, an empty mousetrap, a ship in a bottle, a glass-fronted case full of chunks of rock, a pair of old thigh-high boots, flopped over sideways as if they were tired, a cluster of battered pewter mugs. "Gosh," said Simon. Muffled noises of protest came from below, and he hauled himself out through the opening and rolled sideways out of their way on the floor. Barney and Jane came through after him. Simon, said Jane, gazing at him in horror, you're filthy. Well, isn't that just like a girl? All this round you, and you can only see a bit of dust. It'll brush off. He patted ineffectually at his piebald shirt. But isn't it marvelous? Look. Barney, cooing with delight, was picking his way across the littered floor. There's an old ship's wheel, and a rocking chair, and a saddle. I wonder if the captain ever had a horse. A horse? Jane had been trying to look insulted, but failed. This is something like exploring. We might find anything up here. It's a treasure cave. This is what the natives were after. Hear them howling with frustrated rage down there. Dancing round in a circle with the witch doctor cursing us all. Well, he can curse away, Barney said cheerfully. We've got enough provisions for ages. I'm hungry. Oh, not yet. You can't be. It's only 4 o'clock. Well, that's tea time. Anyway, when you're on the run, you eat little and often, because you daren't ever stop for long. If we were Eskimos, we'd be chewing an old shoelace. My book says... Never mind your book, Simon said. He fished inside the rucksack. Here, have an apple and keep quiet. I want to look at everything properly, before we have our picnic, and if I can wait, so can you. I don't see why, Barney said, but he bit into his apple cheerfully and wandered across the room, disappearing between the high brass skeleton of the old bed and an empty cupboard. For half an hour they poked about in a happy, dusty dream, through the junk and broken furniture and ornaments. It was like reading the story of somebody's life, Jane thought, as she gazed at the tiny matchstick masts of the ship, sailing motionless forever in the green glass bottle. All these things had been used once, had been part of every day in the house below. Someone had slept on the bed, anxiously watched the minutes on the clock, pounced joyfully on each magazine as it arrived. But all those people were long dead, or gone away, and now the oddments of their lives were piled up here, forgotten. She found herself feeling rather sad. I'm ravenous, Barney said plaintively. I'm thirsty. It's all that dust. Come on, let's unload Miss Polk's tea. This attic's rather a swizz, Simon said, squatting on a crackling edge of canvas and undoing the rucksack. All the really interesting boxes are locked. Look at that one, for instance. He nodded towards a black metal chest with 2 rusting padlocks on its lid. I bet it's full of the family jewels. Well, Jane said regretfully, we aren't supposed to touch anything locked, are we? There's a lot more not locked, Simon said, handing her the bottle of lemonade. Here, you'll have to swig from the bottle. We forgot to bring any cups. Don't worry, we won't pinch anything, though I shouldn't think anyone's been up here for years. Food, Barney said. The scones are in that bag there. Help yourself. 4 each, I've counted. Barney reached out an extremely dirty hand. Barney, Jane squeaked, wipe your hand. You'll eat all sorts of germs and get typhoid or rabies or something. Here, have my handkerchief. Rabies is mad dogs, Barney said, looking with interest at the black fingerprints on his scone. Anyway, Father says people make too much fuss about germs. All right, Jane, stop waving that silly thing at me. I've got a proper handkerchief of my own. I don't know how girls ever blow their noses. Scowling, he thrust his free hand into his pocket, then changed his expression to disgust. Ugh, he said, and brought out a brown squashed apple core. I'd forgotten that. All cold and horrible. He flung the core away from him into the far corner of the attic. It bounced, slithered, and rolled into the shadows. Simon grinned. Now you'll bring the rats out. All attics have rats. We shall hear greedy little squeakings and see twin green points of fire, and there'll be rats all over the floor. First they'll eat the apple core, and then they'll come after us. Jane turned pale. Oh no, there wouldn't be rats up here, would there? If there were, they'd have eaten all the newspaper, Barney said hopefully. Wouldn't they? I expect they don't like ink. All old houses have rats. We've got them at school. You can hear them scuttling about in the roof sometimes. Come to think of it, their eyes are red, not green." Simon's voice began to lose its brightness. He was beginning to feel slightly unhappy about the rats himself now. "I think maybe you'd better pick up that apple core, just in case." Barney gave an exaggerated sigh and got to his feet, swallowing his scone in 2 gigantic bites. "Where did it go, then?" "Over there somewhere. I wonder why they didn't put anything in this corner." He crawled about on his hands and knees aimlessly. "Come and help. I can't find it." Then he noticed a triangular gap in the sloping wall of the attic where its planks joined the floor. He peered through and saw daylight gleaming dimly through the tiles. Just inside the gap, the floorboards ended, and he could feel wide-spaced beams. "I think it must have gone through this hole," he called. "I'm going to look." Jane dived across the floor towards him. "Oh, do be careful. There might be a rat." "Couldn't be," Barney said, halfway through the gap. "There's light coming through the tiles, and I can see, more or less. Can't see any core, though. I wonder if it fell between the floorboards and the underneath part. Ow!" His rear half jerked suddenly. "What is it? Oh, do come out." Jane tugged at his shorts. "I touched something. But it can't be a rat. It didn't move. Where it's gone. Here it is. Feels like cardboard. Blah. Here's that disgusting core next to it as well." His voice grew suddenly louder as he backed out of the hole, flushed and blinking. "Well, there it is," he said triumphantly, flourishing the apple core. "Now the rats will have to come and get it. I still don't believe there are any." "What's that other thing you've got?" Simon looked curiously at a tattered scroll-like object in Barney's other hand. "Piece of wallpaper, I think. I bet you've eaten all the scones, you pigs." Barney bounded back across the floor, making the floorboards rattle. He sat down, pulled out his handkerchief, waved it ostentatiously at Jane, wiped his hands, and began to munch another scone. As they ate, he reached over and idly unrolled the scroll he had found, holding one end down on the floor with his toe and pushing the other back with a piece of wood until it lay stretched open before them. And then, as they saw what it was, they all suddenly forgot their eating and stared. The paper Barney had unrolled was not paper at all, but a kind of thick, brownish parchment, springy as steel, with long raised cracks crossing it where it had been rolled. Inside it, another sheet was stuck down, darker, looking much older, ragged at the edges, and covered with small writing in strange, squashed-looking dark brown letters. Below the writing it dwindled, as if it had been singed by some great heat long ago, into half-detached pieces carefully laid back together and stuck to the outer sheet. But there was enough of it left for them to see at the bottom a rough drawing that looked like the uncertain outline of a map. For a moment they were all very quiet. Barney said nothing, but he could feel a strange excitement bubbling up inside him. He leant forward in silence and carefully stretched the manuscript flat, pushing the piece of wood aside. "Here," Simon said. "I'll get something to weight the edges down." They put an old paperweight, a pewter mug, and 2 carefully dusted chunks of wood on the corners, and sat back on their heels to look. "It's terribly old," Jane said. "Centuries, thousands of years. Like those papers in glass cases in museums, with little curtains to keep the light out." "Where did it come from? How did it get up here?" "Somebody must have hidden it." "But it's older than the house. I mean, look at it. It must be. Some of the writing's nearly faded away." "It wasn't hidden," Barney said with absolute conviction, though he had no clear idea why. "Someone just threw it down there where I found it." Simon whooped suddenly, making them jump. "This is terrific! Do you realize we've got a real-life treasure map? It could lead us to anything, anywhere. Secret passages, real hidden caves, the treasure of Trewisic." He rolled the words lovingly round his tongue. "There isn't much map. It's all writing." "Well then, that's instructions. 'Look in ye little room on ye second floor,' I expect it says. Ye second floorboard on the, left. When this was written, there weren't such things as floorboards. Oh, come off it, it's not that old. I bet it is, Barney said quietly. Anyway, you look at this writing. You can't read it. It's all in some funny language. Of course you can read it if you look properly, Simon said impatiently. In his mind, he was already halfway through a sliding panel, throwing back the lid of a chest to reveal hoards of untold wealth. He could almost hear the chink of doubloons. Let's have a look. He leant forward, the floorboards hard and rough under his knees, and peered at the manuscript. There was a long pause. Oh, he said at last, reluctantly. Barney said nothing, but looked at him very expressively indeed. Well, all right, said Simon. There's no need to look so cocky. It isn't in English, but that doesn't mean we shan't be able to find out what it says. Why isn't it in English? How on earth should I know? I mean, Barney said patiently, that we're in England. So what other language could it possibly be in? Latin? Jane said unexpectedly. She had been looking quietly at the manuscript over Simon's shoulder. Latin? Yes, all old manuscripts are written in Latin. The monks used to write them down with a goose feather for a pen, and put flowers and birds and things all squiggling round the capital letters. There isn't anything squiggling here. It looks as if it's been written in rather a hurry. I can't even see any capital letters at all. But why Latin? Demanded Barney. I don't know. The monks just always used it, that's all. It was one of their things. I suppose it's a religious-sounding kind of language. Well, Simon does Latin. Yes, come on, Simon. Translate it, Jane said maliciously. At school she had not yet begun Latin, but he had been learning it for 2 years and was rather superior about the fact. I don't think it's Latin at all, Simon said rebelliously. He peered at the manuscript again. This writing's so odd. The letters all look the same, like a lot of little straight lines all in a row. The light in here isn't very good either. You're just making excuses. No, I'm not. It's jolly difficult. Well, if you can't even recognize Latin when you see it, can't be nearly as good as you make out. Have another look, Barney said hopefully. I think it's in 2 parts, Simon said slowly. 1 little paragraph on top, and then a lot more altogether after a gap. The second bit I can't make out at all, but the first paragraph does look as if it might be in Latin. The first word looks like cum, that means with, but I can't see what comes after it. Then later on there's post multos annos, that's after many years. But the writing's all so small and squashy, I can't... Wait a minute. There's some names in the last line. It says Marco Arturoque. Like Marco Polo, Jane said doubtfully. What a funny name. Not 1 name, it's 2. Que means and, only they put it on the end instead of in the middle. So O on the end is the ablative of us, so this means by, with, or from Marcus and Arturus. By, with, or from? What a... Barney, whatever's the matter? Barney, red in the face and spluttering, had suddenly thumped his fist on the floor, caught his breath trying to say something, and collapsed into a thunderous fit of coughing. They patted him on the back and gave him a drink of lemonade. Marcus and Arturus, he said hoarsely, gulping his breath back. Don't you see? It's Mark and Arthur. It's about King Arthur and his knights. Mark was one of them, and he was king of Cornwall. It must be about them. Gosh, Simon said, I think he's right. It must be that. I bet old King Mark left some treasure behind somewhere, and that's why there's a map. Suppose we find it. We'd be rich. We'd be famous. We shall have to tell Mother and Father, Jane said. The 2 boys stopped thumping each other ecstatically and looked at her. Whatever for? Well, Jane said lamely, taken aback, I suppose we ought to, that's all. Barney sat back on his heels again, frowning, and riffled his fingers through his hair, which by now looked several shades darker than it had when they came up to the attic. I wonder what they'd say. I know what they'd say, Simon said promptly. They'd say it was all our imagination, and anyway they'd tell us to put the manuscript back where we found it because it isn't ours. Well, said Jane, it isn't, is it? It's a treasure trove, findings, keepings. But we know it in someone else's, but we found it in someone else's house. It belongs to the captain. You know what Mother said about not touching anything. She said anything that was put away. This wasn't put away, it was just chucked down in a corner. I found it, Barney said. It was all forgotten and dusty. I bet you anything the captain hadn't a clue it was there. Oh, honestly, Jane, Simon said, you can't find a treasure map and just say, oh, how nice, and put it back again. And that's what they'd make us do. Oh, well, Jane said doubtfully, I suppose you're right. We can always put it back afterwards. Barney had turned to the manuscript again. Hey, he said, look at this top part. The old manuscript that's stuck down on the parchment. What's it made of? I thought it was parchment like the outside bit, but when you look properly it isn't, and it's not paper either. It's some funny thick stuff, and it's hard like wood. He touched an edge of the strange brown surface gingerly with one finger. Be careful, Jane said nervously. It might crumble away into dust before our eyes or something. I suppose you'd still want to go showing everyone even then, Simon said acidly. Look what we found. Does it matter if we touch it? And show them a little heap of dust in a matchbox? Jane said nothing. Oh, well, never mind, Simon said, relenting. She meant well after all. Hey, it's getting awfully dark up here. Do you think we ought to go down? They'll be looking for us soon. Mother will have stopped painting. It is getting late. Jane looked around the attic and shivered suddenly. The big echoing room was growing dark, and there was a dismal sound now to the rain faintly tapping on the glass. Back in their bedrooms, the boys' wardrobe pushed in again to hide the small secret door, they washed and changed hurriedly as the curt clang of the ship's bell calling them to supper echoed up the stairs. Simon changed his dusty shirt, rolling the clean one into a crumpled ball before he put it on, and hoping no one would notice it was fresh. There was not very much they could do about Barney's hair, now khaki. It's like what Mother says about that rug in the living room at home, Jane said in despair, trying to brush out the dust while her brother wriggled in protest. It shows every mark. Perhaps we ought to wash it, Simon peered at Barney critically. No, Barney said. Oh well, there isn't time really. Anyway, I'm hungry. You'll just have to sit away from the light. But when they were all sitting round the supper table, it soon became clear that no one was going to ask questions about where they had been. The evening began as one of those times when everything seemed determined to go wrong. Mother looked tired and depressed, and did not say very much, signs they knew that her day's painting had not been a success. Father, gloomy after the gray day, erupted into wrath when Rufus bounced in dripping from his walk and banished him to the kitchen with Mrs. Polk. And Great-Uncle Mary had come in silent and thoughtful, mysteriously brooding. He sat at one end of the table, alone, staring into the middle distance like a great carved totem pole. The children eyed him warily, and took care to pass him the salt before he had to ask. But Great-Uncle Mary scarcely seemed to see them. He ate automatically, picking up his food and guiding it to his mouth without taking the slightest notice of it. Barney wondered for a wistful moment what would happen if he were to slip a cork table mat onto his great-uncle's plate. Hey, Sully, I think I hear Felicia outside at the door. I think. She probably wants to come see you. Felicia's a dog, for all you curious listeners. Yeah, it's like some child wandering around the neighborhood. Oh, She's scratching at the door again. All right. Um, Mrs. Polk came in with an enormous apple tart and a dish of mounded yellow cream and clattered the dirty plates into a pile. She went out down the hall, and they heard the rich rolling contralto of "O God, our help in ages past," echoing into the distance. Father sighed. "There are times," he said irritably, "when I could dispense with devotions at every meal." "The Cornish," boomed Great Uncle Mary from the shadows, "are a devout and evangelical people." "I dare say," said Father. He passed Simon the cream. Simon helped himself to a large spoonful, and a yellow blob dropped from the spoon to the tablecloth. "Oh, Simon," Mother said, "do look what you're doing." "I couldn't help it. It just fell." "That comes of trying to take too much at once," Father said. "Well, you like it too." "Possibly, but I don't try to transport a quart in a pint pot." "What do you mean?" "Never mind," Father said. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Simon, that's just making it worse." Simon, in an attempt to retrieve the blob of cream with his spoon, had left a large yellow smear on the cloth. "Sorry." "I should think so." "Did you go fishing today, Father?" Jane said hopefully from across the table, feeling that it was time to change the subject. "No," said Father. "Don't be stupid," Simon said ungratefully, still smarting. "It was raining." "Well, Father does go fishing in the rain sometimes." "No, he doesn't." "Yes, he does." "If I may be allowed to explain my own actions," Father said with heavy sarcasm, "occasionally I have been known to go fishing in the rain. Today I did not. Is that comprehensible?" "Have some apple tart, dear," said Mother, handing him a plate. Father said, glancing at her sideways, and he lapsed into silence. After a moment he said hopefully, "Might be an idea if we all went for a walk after supper. It seems to be clearing up." Everyone looked out the window, and the temperature of the room rose several degrees. Over the sea the clouds had broken, leaving a deepening blue sky, and the opposite headland glowed suddenly a brighter green as the sinking sun shone for the first time that day. Then they heard the doorbell ring. "Bother," Mother said wearily. "Whoever can that be?" Mrs. Polk's footsteps rang briskly past the door, and then back again. She put her head in. "'Tis some people for you, Dr. Drew." "Stand by to repel boarders," Father said, and he went out into the hall. In a few moments he was back, talking to someone over his shoulder as he came through the door. "Very kind of you indeed. We hadn't really thought what we were going to do tomorrow. They're an independent lot, you know. Well, here we are." He beamed heartily round with what the family called his public face. "My wife, Simon, Jane, Barney. This is Mr. and Mrs. Withers, from that yacht you admire so much, Simon. We met in the harbor this morning." A man and a girl stood behind him in the doorway. Both were dark-haired, with beaming smiles, bright and sun-tanned faces. They looked like beings suddenly materialized from another very tidy planet. The man stepped forward, holding out his hand. "How do you do, Mrs. Drew?" They sat staring blankly at him as he advanced towards Mother. He wore dazzling white flannel trousers and a blazer with a dark blue scarf tucked in the neck of his white shirt, and they had not expected to see anything like him in Troissic at all. Then they jumped up hastily as Mother stood to shake hands, and Simon knocked over his chair. Into the confusion, Mrs. Polk appeared with a large teapot and a tray of cups and saucers. "2 extra cups," she said, smiling blandly, and departed again. "Do sit down," the girl said. "We only popped in for a moment. We didn't want to interrupt." She bent to help Simon pick up his chair. Her black curls bobbed forward over her forehead. She was a very pretty girl, Jane thought, watching her. Much older than any of them, of course. She wore a bright green shirt and black trousers, and her eyes seemed to twinkle with a kind of hidden private laughter. Jane suddenly felt extremely young. Mr. Withers, showing a lot of very white teeth, was talking to Mother. "Mrs. Drew, do please forgive this intrusion. We had no intention of breaking into your supper." "Not at all," said Mother, looking faintly bemused. "Won't you have a cup of tea?" "Thank you, no, most kind, but we have a meal waiting on the boat. We simply came to issue an invitation. My sister and I are in Trewisick for some days, with the yacht to ourselves, on our way round the coast, you know. And we wondered whether you and the children would care to spend a day out at sea. We have—" "Gosh!" Simon nearly upset his chair again. "How marvelous! You mean go out in that fabulous boat?" "I do indeed," said the smiling Mr. Withers. Simon spluttered without words, his face glowing with delight. Mother said hesitantly, "Well, of course I realize we're descending on you out of the blue," Mr. Withers said soothingly, "but it would be pleasant to have company for a change, and when we met your husband in the harbour master's office this morning and discovered we are neighbours in London—" "Are you?" said Barney curiously from the table. "Where?" "Marylebone High Street, just round the corner from you." "Oh, wait, that's the girl." "Marylebone High Street, just round the corner from you," said the girl, dimpling at him. "Norman sells antiques." She looked across at Mother. "I expect you and I use the same shops, Mrs. Drew. You know that little patisserie where you can get those gorgeous rumbabas?" "I try not to," Mother said, beginning to smile. "Well, really, this is very kind, considering you're strangers, but I'm not sure whether, well, the three of them can be rather a handful, you know." "Mother!" Simon looked aghast. Mr. Withers puckered his nose boyishly at her. "But my invitation extends to the whole family, Mrs. Drew. We sincerely hope you and your husband will join our little crew as well. Just a trip out and back, you understand, round the bay, as the commercial gentlemen have it, with perhaps a little fishing. I shall enjoy showing off the boat. Tomorrow, perhaps. They say it should be a fine day." What an old-fashioned way of talking he has, Jane thought idly. Perhaps it comes of selling antiques. She looked at Simon and Barney, both all eagerness at the idea of a day on the strange yacht, gazing anxiously at their parents, and then back at Mr. Withers' immaculate white flannels and folded scarf. "I don't like him," she thought. "I wonder why." "Well, thank you very much indeed," Mother said finally. "I don't think I shall come, if you'll forgive me. If the sun comes out, I shall go and work up above the harbour. But I know Dick and the children would love to go." "Ah, yes, Dr. Drew was telling us all about your painting," Mr. Withers said warmly. "Well, the loss will be ours, but if the muse calls, dear lady, the rest of the family will come, though, I hope." "Not half," said Simon swiftly. "It sounds smashing," Barney said. He added as an afterthought, "Thank you very much." "Well," said Father cheerfully, "this is a noble gesture, I must say. We're all very grateful to you. As a matter of fact," he looked vaguely round the room, "there should have been one other member of the family here, but he seems to have disappeared. My wife's uncle. He rented the house for us." The children automatically followed his gaze round the room. They had forgotten Great Uncle Mary. Now they realized that there had been no sign of him since the two sudden visitors appeared. The door that led into the breakfast room at the back of the house stood slightly open, but when Barney ran across to look in, there was no one there. I wish I had a breakfast room. Man, I just realized I'm missing out. I need a breakfast room. I could dedicate a whole period to that. Right after I get up, probably. The door that led into the breakfast room at the back of the house stood slightly open, but when Barney ran across to look in, there was no one there. "Professor Lyon, you mean?" the girl said. "That's right." Father stared at her for a moment. "I didn't think I'd mentioned him this morning. Do you know him, then?" Mr. Withers answered for her quickly and smoothly. I believe we have met once or twice, in another sphere than this, in the course of our work, you know. A charming old gentleman, as I remember, but a little unpredictable. That he certainly is, Mother said ruefully, always dashing off somewhere. He hasn't even finished his supper this time. But do let me give you some tea or coffee. Thank you, but I think we should be getting back, the girl said. Vane will have supper waiting. Mr. Withers pulled down the edges of his immaculate blazer with a precise, feminine gesture. You're quite right, Polly. We mustn't be late. He swung his white smile round the room like a lighthouse. Vane is our skipper, the professional on board, and an excellent chef, too. You must sample his cooking tomorrow. Well, now, shall we see you all down in the harbour if the weather is fine? 9:30, perhaps? We will have the dinghy waiting at the quay. Splendid. Father moved with him out into the hall, and everyone straggled after them. On the way, Polly Withers paused and looked up over Simon's head at the old Cornish maps hanging among the oil paintings on the dark wall. Do look, Norman. Aren't they marvellous? She turned to Mother. This really is a wonderful house. Did your uncle rent it from a friend? A Captain Toms. We've never met him. He's abroad. Quite an old man. A retired sailor of some kind. I believe his family have owned the Grey House for years. A fascinating place. Mr. Withers was looking about him with a professional eye. He has some beautiful old books, I see. He reached one hand idly down to the door of a long, low bookcase in the hall, but it would not open. I'll keep everything locked, Father said. You know what it is with a furnished house. One's always nervous of damaging things. An admirable principle, Mr. Withers said formally. But his sister was smiling down at Simon. I bet it's a wonderful place to explore, though, isn't it? Oh, isn't it? She said. Have you children been looking for secret tunnels and things yet? I know I should have done, in an old house. Do let us know if you find one. Simon said politely, feeling Barney's anxious eyes on his back, Oh, I don't think there's anything like that here. Well, till tomorrow, then, Mr. Withers said from the doorstep, and they were gone. Isn't that terrific? Barney said eagerly when the door closed. A whole day out on that yacht. Do you think they'll let us help sail her? Mind you keep out of their way until you're asked, said Father. We don't want any casualties. Well, you could be ship's doctor. I'm on holiday, remember? Why didn't you tell us you'd met them? Demanded Simon. I was going to, Father said meekly. I expect I was too busy being irritable. He grinned. You can let Rufus out now if you want to, Barney, but he's not going on the boat tomorrow, so don't ask. Jane said suddenly, I don't think I will either. Well, for goodness sake, Simon stared at her. Why ever not? I should get seasick. Of course you wouldn't, not under sail. There won't be any smelly old engine running. Oh, come on, Jane. No, said Jane more firmly. I'm not batty about boats like you are. I really don't want to go. They won't mind, will they, Father? Simon said in disgust. You must be nuts. Leave her alone, said his father. She knows her own mind. No, they'll understand, Jane. No one would want you to be worried about getting ill. See how you feel about it in the morning, though. I do think it would be safer not, Jane said. But she said nothing about her real reason for not wanting to go. It would have sounded too silly to explain that she felt a strange uneasiness about the tall white yacht and about the smiling Mr. Withers and his pretty sister. The more she thought about it, the sillier it seemed, so that in the end she convinced herself, as well as everybody else, that her reason for avoiding the trip was nothing but fear of seasickness. But again, nobody knew where Great Uncle Mary had gone. All right, how's everybody doing? I can go into chapter 4. It's 8:50 local time. For London, it's I'm guessing maybe 5:30. or something like that. Yeah. So thank you for tuning in again, and we'll do a little bit of chapter 4. Maybe I'll finish it. Cheers. Drinking some delicious tea because I have to with this book, I think. I'm very hungry for a yellow cream tart too. That was, oof, man. Okay, chapter 4. A white morning haze lay over the sea, and down in the harbor the boats shifted idly on still water, bright under the sun. Jane peered down from her window. The fishing boats were deserted, but she could see 2 small figures clambering from a dinghy beside the quay. Simon said, behind her, "I brought this in for you to look after, if you really aren't coming." She turned and saw him holding out a gray woolen sock. It looked peculiarly stiff and cylindrical. "What on earth's so special about your socks?" Simon grinned, but lowered his voice. "It's the manuscript. I couldn't think of anything else to put it in." Jane laughed, took the sock, and pulled the manuscript out halfway. But even though she handled it gently, the edges cracked and crumbled ominously as they caught in the wool. "Hey," she said, alarmed. "If that's going to happen every time, the whole thing will fall to bits in a week. It was all right lying up there in the attic, lying there for years without anyone touching it, but if we're going to carry it around..." Simon looked anxiously at the curled parchment, its battered edges dark with age, and saw cracks that had not been there before. He said, troubled, "But we'll have to handle it so much if we're going to find out what it means. Wait a minute, though. That room..." Leaving Jane baffled, he seized the manuscript and ran downstairs to the small dark door on the first floor landing which led to the passage they had discovered on the way to the attic. It was still unlocked. He stepped down into the tiny passage and across to the bare, austere room that they had decided was the captain's bedroom. It was just as it had been the day before, and the telescope case was still lying on the wooden sill. Simon picked up the case and unscrewed it. The thread of each half was bright and untarnished, shining with a faint film of oil, and the copper lining inside, when he held it up to the light, glinted dry and clean. He dropped the rolled manuscript inside. It fitted perfectly, resting snugly between the 2 halves when he screwed them together again. Simon looked thoughtfully round the room, as if it might tell him something. But there was nothing but the silence and the mysterious lived-in emptiness, and he closed the door again, gently, and ran back upstairs. "Look," he said to Jane. "Might have been made for it." "Perhaps it was," said Jane, taking the case. "You'd better hide it somewhere," said Simon. "What about the top of our wardrobe?" "I'll think of a good place," said Jane thoughtfully. But Simon, halfway back to his own room already, hardly heard her. Already his mind was racing ahead to the day on the Withers' yacht. And by the time he, Barney, and Father were gone, in a great scuffle of argument over oilskins and pullovers and bathing trunks, Jane was almost beginning to wish she had changed her mind and gone too. But she said firmly, to Simon's final jeers, "No, I'd only spoil it all if I got sick." And instead she stood watching from the window as they ran down to the quay, and the little dinghy bobbed out to the tall, slim white yacht. Her mother, easel under one arm and a bag of sandwiches and paints in the other hand, looked at her doubtfully. "Darling, are you sure you aren't going to be lonely?" "Goodness, no," said Jane stoutly. "I shall just wander about. It'll be fun." "Honestly, I mean, you don't get lonely when you're painting, do you?" Mother laughed. "All right, Independence, you wander. Don't get lost. I shall be up above the harbor on the other side if you want me. Mrs. Polk's going to be here all day. She'll get your lunch. Why don't you take Rufus for a walk?" She went out into the sunshine, her eyes already vague with the shape and color of her painting. Jane felt a wet nose push at her hand, looked down at Rufus's large, hopeful brown eyes, laughed, and ran off with him down into the village, through the small, strange streets, and the Cornish voices lilting from the doorways of the shops. Man, how much would you love to just be able to run around town with a dog and have nobody be like, "You're irresponsible," and, I'm gonna call the cops. That would be so great. Uh, that's what we have McDonald Forest for, right? But all the morning she felt curiously restless, as if something were jostling to push itself to the front of her mind. As if, she thought, her mind were trying to say something to her that she couldn't quite hear. When she brought Rufus home, to collapse in a panting red heap in the kitchen beside Mrs. Polk, she was still thoughtful and subdued. "Nice walk, lovey," said Mrs. Polk, sitting back on her heels. She had a bucket of soapy water beside her, and her face was red and shiny. She had been scrubbing the gray slate floor. Jane said vaguely. She fiddled with the bow on her ponytail. "Avie's lunch ready in just a minute," Mrs. Polk said, scrambling to her feet. "My, just look at that dog. Proper wore out. Needs a drink of water, I'll be bound." She reached for Rufus's dish. "I'll go up and wash." Jane wandered out through the hall, the cool dark passage with the sunlight shafting in on one of the old maps that Polly Withers had exclaimed over with delight. Miss Withers. Why should she and her brother have seemed sinister? They were perfectly ordinary people. There was no real reason to think otherwise. It was kind of them to have asked everyone out for the day on the yacht. Odd, though, that remark she had made about exploring and finding things. Manana, do you need something, buddy?
No, I'm just...
You all done with your bath?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, nice. Your hair looks good.
Continue reading.
All right, I'll continue reading. Thanks, buddy. And it was kind of them to have asked everyone out for the day on the yacht. Odd, though, that remark she had made about exploring and finding things. Finding things. Halfway up the stairs, Jane remembered with the sudden shock of guilt that she had left the manuscript alone all the morning, shut in its new case in the drawer of her bedside table. Should she have taken it with her? No, don't be silly, she thought, but she scuttled up the stairs and into her room anxiously, and felt a surge of relief as she saw the case lying quietly, glinting in the drawer. She drew out the brown roll of parchment and took it to the window, gingerly straightening it out. The lines of cramped black lettering gave her the same shiver of uneasy excitement that she had felt in the attic, at the moment when suddenly they had all three realized what they were looking at. She peered at it, but the squat chunks of words were no more legible now than they had been then. She could just make out the initials of the words that Simon had said were Mark and Arthur. How were they ever to find out what it all meant? She looked down at the bottom of the curling sheet, at the few thin wavering lines that they had thought might be a map. In the dim light of the attic, there had been so little there to see, but now Jane had the full white glare of midday. She bent closer, suddenly realizing that there were more lines in the map than she had noticed at first, lines so faint that before she had mistaken them for cracks, and among them, fainter still, some words were written. It was a very rough map, as if it had been hurriedly drawn. It seemed to be coastline, looking rather like a letter W lying on its side, with two inlets and a headland, or was it two headlands and an inlet? There was no way of telling which side was supposed to be the sea. And although she could just see that there was a word written across one of the projecting arms of land, or sea, it was made totally unreadable by one of the breaks in the ancient crumbling parchment, a crack crossing the word out as neatly as if it had been a thick ink line. "Bother," said Jane crossly, aloud. She realized as she said it that she had become determined in the last half-minute to have some discovery of her own about the manuscript to announce to Simon and Barney when they came back from their day on the boat. That was what had been niggling at the back of her mind all the morning. One other name was written across the map, if it was a name. The letters were small and brown, but more distinct than those on the rest of the manuscript. Jane worked them out one by one and found they made 3 words. Ring, mark, heed, H-E-D-E, or maybe Yeah, she stared, disappointed. It meant nothing. Ring, ring, mark, heed, she said experimentally. It wasn't even a place. How could a place have a name like that? The clang of the ship's bell in the hall came echoing up the stairs, breaking into the stillness of the sea's murmur and the distant gulls, and she heard Mrs. Polk calling faintly below, "Jane! Jane!" Hastily she rolled up the manuscript and dropped it back into the telescope case, screwing the two halves tight together. She opened the drawer of her bedside table, hesitated for a moment, then shut it again. Better not to let it out of her sight. She snatched a cardigan from the bed, wrapped it round the case, and ran out and down the stairs 2 at a time. But she ran too fast. Swinging round a corner of the first-floor landing, she bumped heavily against a long, low wooden chest lying in the shadows, and yelped with pain. It would have to be the same leg she had heard down on the quay. But as she bent to rub her knee, something drew her attention away. The chest she had knocked against was the one they had noticed the day before, with the lid locked. Native gold and ornaments, Simon had said, and then found he couldn't open it. But now the lid had sprung open a few inches, and was rocking gently up and down. It must have been stuck, not locked. Her collision had jerked it loose. Curiously, Jane lifted it fully open. There was not much inside. Some old newspapers, a big pair of leather gloves, 2 or 3 heavy woolen sweaters, and half hidden, a small black-covered book. A very dull treasure, she thought. But the book might be interesting. She reached down inside and picked it up. "Jane!" Mrs. Pollock's voice was nearer, coming up the stairs. Guiltily, Jane dropped the lid and bundled the little book inside the folds of her cardigan with the telescope case. Mrs. Pollock's face puffed into view through the banisters. "Coming," Jane said meekly. "Ah, there, thought he'd gone to bed. Getting too fat for they stairs, I am." Mrs. Pollock beamed at her. "Lunch is on the table. I were taking me pastry out of the oven, or I'd not have kept ye so long." She waddled back to the kitchen. A mounded plateful of ham and salad waited for Jane in the dining room, like a small bright island in the glossy sea of the polished mahogany table. Beside it was a dish of gooseberry tart and a small jug of cream. Yeah, how hungry are you guys right now? It's a good British novel for you. I used to read the Redwall books when I was a kid a lot. They're very good, kind of different accents of England, but it's all woodland creatures, and then the villains are like rats and ferrets and stoats and stuff. And they would have like, I don't know, maybe 10 pages sometimes describing a feast. Every book had at least one good feast. And I would just be like, I don't know what damson pudding is, but I want some damson pudding right now. It was, yeah. And those moles, man, they make a good, like, chicken pot pie kind of thing. I'm telling you. Yeah. But anyways, this book makes me hungry too. Jane sat down and ate everything absently, leafing with one hand through the little book she had found in the chest. It was a guidebook to the village, written by the local vicar. "A Short Guide to Trevisick," said the title page in flowing curly type. "Compiled by the Reverend E.J. Hawes Mellor, M.A., LL.D., Vicar of the Parish Church of St. John, Trevisick." Not exciting, thought Jane, her interest dying. She flipped through the narrow pages full of details of rambles through the countryside around. The words from the manuscript were still swimming in before her mind. If only she could have something to tell Simon and Barney about the map. It was then that the guidebook fell open at its center page under her fingers. Jane glanced down idly and then paused. The page showed a detailed map of Trevisick village, with every street, straight and winding, patterned behind the harbor that lay snug between its 2 headlands. The churches, the village hall, were all separately marked. She saw with a quick thrill of pride that the grey house was marked by name on the road that led up to the tip of Kimari Head, and then faded into nothing. Kamar Head, and then faded into nothing. But what caught her attention was the name written neatly across the headland. It read, King Mark's Head. King Mark's Head, said Jane slowly, aloud. She reached down to the bundled cardigan lying beside her chair, drew out the telescope case, and unrolled the manuscript on the table. The words stared up at her, cramped and enigmatic. Ring Mark Heed. And as she looked, she saw that the first letter of the first word, blurred with age and dirt, might very well not be an R, but a K. She gulped with excitement and took a deep breath. King Mark's Head, the same name on both maps. So the map on the manuscript from the attic must be a map of Trewisic, of that very part of Trewisic on which the grey house stood. The strange words must be an old name for Kamar Head. But when the first delighted shock had washed over her, she looked again from one map to the other, and her spirits sank a little. There was something very odd about the wavering outline of the coast drawn on the old manuscript, something more than the inaccuracies you always found in a rough, freehand drawing. The lines of the coast were not the same as those on the guidebook map. The headlands bulged strangely, and the harbor was the wrong shape. Why? Puzzled, Jane fetched a stub of pencil from the sideboard and did her best to draw a faint copy of the manuscript coastline over the one on the guidebook. There was no doubt about it. The shapes were not the same. Perhaps the manuscript didn't show Trewisic after all. Perhaps there were two headlands in Cornwall called King Mark's Head. Or perhaps the coast had changed its shape in the hundreds of years since the manuscript had been drawn. How on earth were they to find it? She put the manuscript reluctantly away and stared at the two outlines, one in print, one in pencil, that she now had on the page of the book. But still she could find no answer. In exasperation, she flipped back the pages of the book and suddenly caught sight of the title page again. The Reverend E.J. Hawes Mellor, M.A. Jane jumped to her feet. That was it. Why not? The vicar of Trewisic must know all about the district. He was the expert. He had written the guidebook. He would know whether the coast had changed its shape and what it had been like before. That was the way to find out, the only way. He was the only person who wouldn't ask why she wanted to know. He would think she was just interested in his book. She must go and find him and ask. And then think how much she would have to tell Simon and Barney when they came home. That was the final thought which decided Jane, normally the shy member of the family, on the way she would spend her afternoon. She turned quickly as the door opened, and Mrs. Polk came rolling in. Finished, Davy? Enjoy it? Lovely, thank you very much. Jane gathered up the guidebook and the precious woolly bundle of her cardigan. Mrs. Polk, she said tentatively, do you know the vicar of Trewisic? Surely, she thought, with all those hymns. Well, not myself personally, no. Mrs. Polk became very grave and solemn. Being chapel, I don't have no contact with him, though I see him about, of course. Terrible clever man, they do say the vicar is. Was he thinking of taking a look at the church, me dear? Yes, Jane said. After all, I probably shall, she added defensively to herself. 'Tis a beautiful old place. Long way, though, up the hill at the top of the village. You can just see the tower through the trees growing up Fish Street from the quay. I think I know. Don't get sunstroke now. Mrs. Polk sailed benevolently out with the dishes, and in a moment Jane heard Abide with me echoing with rich, gloomy relish down the hall from the kitchen. She ran upstairs, looked hastily round for a place where she might hide the manuscript case, and finally tucked it among the covers at the foot of her bed, so that it could lie along the edge of the mattress and leave no bump. Then, before her nervousness could get the better of her new idea, she went out, clutching her guidebook, into the sleepy afternoon sun. The church at the top of the hill seemed cut off from the sea. Jane could see nothing from there but trees and the hills, and even the little village houses ended some 20 yards down the road. The square gray church with its low tower and the big gate posts opposite it might have been in any wooded valley 100 miles from the sea. In the churchyard, a wizened old man in shirt sleeves and braces was cutting the grass with a pair of shears. Or do you say wizened? Wizened or wizened? Jane stopped near him on the other side of the wall. "Excuse me," she said loudly, "but is that the vicarage over there?" The old man, wheezing, straightened himself by holding one arm round to push himself in the small of the back. "That's right," he said laconically, and then just stood there, staring without expression, watching her all the way across the road and up the drive. Jane heard her feet crunching on the gravel, enormously loud in the silent afternoon. The big gray house, its windows empty and lifeless, seemed to dare her to disturb it. It was a very scruffy house, she thought, for a vicarage. The gravel of the drive was clotted with weeds, and in the rambling garden hydrangea bushes grew spindly and neglected. In the rambling garden hydrangea bushes grew spindly and neglected, with the grass of the lawns as high as hay. She pressed the bell push by the side of the peeling door and heard a bell ring faintly inside the house, echoing a long way off. After a long time, when she had just begun to decide with relief that no one was there to answer the bell, she heard footsteps inside the house. The door opened, creaking resentfully as if it did not open often at all. The man standing there was tall and dark, untidy in an old sports jacket, but at the same time forbidding, with the thickest black eyebrows that Jane had ever seen growing almost straight across his brow without a break in the middle. He stared down at her. "Yes." His voice was very deep, without a trace of accent. "Is Mr. Hosmeller in, please?" The tall man frowned. "Mr. who?" "Mr. Hosmeller, the vicar." His face cleared a little, though still the intent black-brown stare did not relax. "Ah, I see. Mr. Hosmeller, I'm afraid, is no longer vicar here. He died a number of years ago." "Oh," said Jane, and stepped back off the doorstep, not at all sorry at the chance to go away. "Oh, well, in that case—" "Perhaps I can be of some help," he said in the deep, mournful voice. "My name is Hastings. I have replaced Mr. Hosmeller here." "Oh," Jane said again. She was beginning to find the lone Mr. Hastings and his strange, neglected house and garden rather unnerving. "Oh, no, I don't want to be a nuisance. It was only something about a book he wrote, a guidebook to the village." A flicker of interest seemed to wake in the vicar's dark face. "A guidebook to Trevisick. There was some talk that he had written one, but I have never been able to trace a copy. What was it that you wanted to ask? I am afraid that if you are looking for the book, I can be of no help." "Oh, no," Jane said, not without pride. "I've got one." She held her little guidebook up to show him. "It was just something inside it about the village that I wondered if he'd got wrong." The vicar stared down at the book, opened his mouth to say something, and then seemed to change his mind. He held the door wider open and moved his mouth into an uneasy smile. "Well, do come in for a few moments, young lady, and we'll see what we can do. I know a little about Trevisick myself after my many years here." "Thank you very much," Jane said nervously. She stepped inside the door, hitching up the ribbon on her ponytail as she followed him down the passage, and hoping she looked reasonably tidy. Not that she would have been out of place if she had been in rags, she thought, looking around her, seeing that the vicarage was one of the most unloved-looking and shabbiest houses she had ever seen. It was big and rambling, with more sense of space than the gray house, but the paint was peeling, the walls grubby and the floors all bare with one or two faded rugs. She began to feel rather sorry for the vicar as he strode stiffly along ahead of her. He led her into a room which was obviously his study, with a big desk strewn with papers, two battered cane chairs with faded cushions, and shelves of books all round the walls. Tall French windows stood wide open to show the stretch of long grass that Jane had glimpsed from the front drive. "Now," he said, sitting down behind his desk and clearing a space impatiently in the litter of papers on its top. "Sit yourself down and tell me what you are going to ask Mr. Hawes Mellor. You found a copy of his book, have you?" He stared again at the book in Jane's hand. It seemed to fascinate him. "Yes," Jane said. "Would you like to have a look at it?" She held the book out to him. The vicar took it, slowly, closing his long fingers round the narrow cover as if it were something infinitely precious. He did not open it, but put it down on the desk before him and looked at it so hard that he seemed not to be seeing it, but thinking about something else. Then he turned his gray, heavy-browed face towards Jane again. "You are on holiday here?" "Yes, my name's Jane Drew. I'm staying with my family in the Grey House." "Are you indeed? That is not a house I am very familiar with." Mr. Hastings smiled rather grimly. "Captain Toms has no time for me, I am afraid. A strange, solitary man." "We've never met him," Jane said. "He's gone abroad." "And this book of yours," his fingers caressed its cover almost unconsciously, "is it interesting?" "Oh, tremendously. I love all the stories about Trewisick and when there were smugglers and things." For a moment Jane wondered doubtfully whether to mention the map after all, but her curiosity overcame any doubts. She stood up and crossed to stand beside him, leafing through the book to the page with the map of South Cornwall. "This was the bit that puzzled me, the shape of the coastline. I wanted to ask if it had ever been different once." Standing behind the vicar, she could not see his face, but his shoulders seemed to stiffen as he looked at the map, and the fingers of his hand lying on the desk curled gently underneath into the palm. "A curious question," he said. I just wondered." "I see there is another line penciled over the coastline of the map here. Is that yours?" "Yes." "From your imagination?" The deep voice was very quiet. "More or less. Well, that is, I saw something like it somewhere, in a book or something." Jane floundered, trying to avoid mentioning their manuscript from the attic without actually telling untruths. "If you know about Trewisick, Mr. Hastings, do you know if the coast has always been the same shape?" "I should not have thought so. I should have thought so. A granite coast takes a very long time to change." He was staring at the penciled line. "You say you saw this outline in a book?" "Oh, a book or another map or something," Jane said vaguely. "In the Grey House?" "We don't touch the captain's books," Jane said automatically, forgetting that the guidebook must be one of them. "But you have no doubt looked around them?" The vicar rose to his feet, towering above her, and reached out a long arm to take a book from one of the shelves. He handed it to Jane. It was very old and covered with shiny scuffed leather, and the pages crackled and gave off a smell of musty age when she opened it. It was called Tales of Lyonesse, and a lot of the S's were printed like F's. "Have you seen any book there like that?" His voice was persistent. He stood between Jane and the light, and looking up at him she could see nothing but a faint glint of light reflected from his eyes in the shadowed face. The effect was for a moment exceedingly sinister, and Jane felt creeping over her the small cold uneasiness that was becoming familiar about the holiday, a sense of something mysterious that everyone else knew about but that was hidden from her brothers and her. No, I don't think so. Are you sure? A title like that, perhaps. You might have seen a map in such a book. No, really, we just haven't looked. Might you not have seen a volume on a shelf similar to this? I honestly don't know, Jane said, shrinking back in her chair at the urgency that had come into his voice. Why don't you ask the captain? Mr. Hastings took the book back from her and tucked it back in its place on the shelf. The grave, near frown was back on his face. He is not a communicative man, he said shortly. Uneasiness was nudging more insistently at Jane's mind, and she began to fidget from one foot to another. Well, I must be off home, she said, using one of Mother's phrases brightly and hoping it sounded polite. I'm sorry to have interrupted you. She glanced rather wildly from the window to the door. The vicar, standing silent and intent, pulled himself together and moved towards the French windows. You can come out this way, it's quicker. The front door is seldom used. He held out his hand to Jane. I am pleased to have met you, Miss Drew. I am sorry not to have been more helpful, but I must say I think it unlikely that our coast here has ever had any characteristics that are not shown on Mr. Haas Meller's map. He was, I understand, a cartographer of some repute. I am glad you came to see me. He inclined his head gravely as he shook Jane's hand with a strange archaic gesture that reminded her suddenly of Mr. Withers when he left the Grey House. But this, she thought, seemed more genuine, as if it were something which Mr. Withers had been trying to imitate. Goodbye, she said quickly, and ran off through the long feathery grass toward the drive of the silent shabby house and the road that led back home. Alrighty, guys. Ooh, the vicar. He's got a nasty unibrow.
Sounded like it.
Yeah. Jane's actually surprisingly, brave when she's made up her mind to see in other books, too. She has kind of more intuition than some of the other characters. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that.
It was very good.
I didn't realize I was going for an hour and 15 minutes. That was fun. But yeah, so that was chapters 3 and 4. And thank you, Kevin, again for reading a poem. If anybody wants to share anything, I mean, lyrics, music, it's all something that a lot of us are missing being together for. Kevin and Jordan and I are working on they've been working on this Western themed album, and I'm getting on a few tracks here recently, but it's usually playing a little bit in the park or out in the garage carport before, because we're not really hanging out inside too much. But even that has been really exciting because every night we're texting new riffs or new ideas. So yeah, I would love anybody that wants to share something. And yeah, any questions about the story or confusions? I know it's just starting.
What's gonna happen next?
Yeah, man, what is gonna happen next? Mr. Withers, that guy gives me the willies a little bit too. It's just his teeth are too clean, especially for England, right? Those are too clean, Mr. Withers. No, that's the poor British people will have to suffer that stereotype endlessly, even though modern dentistry and orthodontics has made its way to England some time ago as well. Yeah, my uncle, who's Japanese, he says that a lot of Americans have lost the personality of their teeth, because he said a lot of people in Japan don't fix their teeth unless it's causing a problem with their bite or something, and so they might have one that's kind of twisted or higher than the neighbors or something. And it is kind of true when you get this obsession with straight white teeth. Everybody kind of looks a little bit more doll-like or something. It's kind of like Stepford Wives style or something.
Piano keys.
Yeah. But I'll go ahead and stop the iPad recording. Thank you so much, guys, for listening, and I hope you're enjoying Susan Cooper. I mean, it
Yes.
really feels kind of playful and silly, and it is, and it always is going to be kind of have that kind of middle school feel to me a little bit. But then there's also a lot of really cool ancient things that are stirring. You know, it's kind of like a lot of good English novels where it's like there's the fantasy novels. You know, there's the world that everybody's kind of more aware of, and then there's parallel worlds that where things that you think perhaps are just tales actually exist, and we love stuff like that in the modern era too. You know, or discovering powers you didn't know about or something. So yeah, it's basically X-Men. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, totally.
No, but thank you for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time on the video recordings.
Cool.